Right, is that okay? Can everybody both see and hear me?
Yes, Liz, we can see and hear you fine. I can, so I'm assuming everyone else can too.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. Sorry, I do apologize. I'm developing a slight sore throat. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce you to my favorite group of plants, that is the bryophytes. Now, before I actually sort of kick off into the details of what bryophytes are and what their morphologies are, I wanted to first give you an indication of how important the Scottish Bryophyte Flora is on a global scale. Now these figures, well, certainly the global figures are slightly approximate because they date from a few years back, and since then there will have been some species added to the global flora and some names synonymized. But basically you're looking at around about 19,500 or just under species of bryophyte globally. Britain and Ireland has, well, when the checklist came out last year, 1,098, it is now 2 more have been added since then. So it's 1,100 bryophyte species, of which 962 occur in Scotland. So Scotland, with a relatively small landmass area, has approximately 5% of the global bryophyte flora. So this is a very significant country when it comes to the conservation and diversity of bryophyte species found here. Why is that? Well, there's three interacting factors which work together to give us a highly diverse bryophyte flora. The first is our climate. As you can see, we, and everyone knows, we have a very wet climate, especially on the west coast. This provides high humidity, which is favorable for bryophyte diversity. And I'll come back to this a bit when we look at ecology and look at the life cycle of bryophytes. The other thing is we have a highly complex geology in Scotland. And this complex geology, combined with a very diverse topography, leads to a wide range of microhabitats within a very small area, and consequently a high range of available niches for bryophytes. Some significant Scottish habitats for bryophytes are our temperate rainforest or Atlantic oak wood. And as you can see, the available surfaces, the rocks, the trees are all coated in a rich and diverse bryophyte flora. The oceanic oak woods, or the temperate rainforest biome, has a relatively limited global distribution. And for its area, Scotland has a disproportionate amount of this biome, and consequently is very important as a habitat for bryophytes. The other important habitat we have a lot of in Scotland is peatlands, and I'll come back to reconsider this at the end. We're looking at both blanket bog, lowland raised bog here, especially acid peatlands, which are extensive within Scotland. And although superficially you might think that they're dominated by flowering plants, when you actually come to look at them in detail, a large proportion of the habitat is in fact occupied by bryophytes, and one particular specific genus of bryophytes, the Sphagnum. So we'll introduce you now to what is a bryophyte, then a little bit about where we find them and why we study them, and finish off with giving you some tips as to how to go around, how to learn to identify the bryophytes, how to get to grips with them as a group. So what is a bryophyte? These are 3 groups of plants: green plants, the hornworts, the liverworts, and the mosses. They are distinct from all other green plants on the surface of the planet. They have their own unique life cycle and a different morphology within each group. So they differ from vascular plants in that they have no vascular system. They don't have roots. They do, in some genera and some families, have specialized conducting cells, but nothing on the to the extent of the vascular system developed by the flowering plants or these ferns and their allies. They don't have roots. They have rhizoids which serve to adhere the plants to the substrate, but none of the root system associated with vascular plants. They don't produce flowers or seeds as we understand them in the flowering plants, and dispersal after the sexual phase is via spores. And a large proportion of the species are capable of various mechanisms for vegetative reproduction, to such an extent there are some species which are only known to have either only all male or all female present at a local or a continental scale. Now, these three groups of plants are united by their life cycle. And the facts that distinguish them from all other green plants is that for the bryophytes, the green plant that we see is the haploid Gametophyte. So it has half the chromosome content, and it is the gamete producing stage in the life cycle. All the flowering plants that we see, the ferns and their allies, these are all the Sporophyte generation. And within these, the Gametophyte is either reduced to a few cells in the life cycle or to a small independent organism. The other thing that unites these is that the Sporophyte generation for the Bryophytes is an unbranched diploid sporophyte or capsule, which is produced by and totally dependent on the Gametophyte for its survival. So if we come to look at our three groups again, you can see here you have the hornwort. This basal mat of tissue is the persistent Gametophyte, which you will find throughout the season. And these outgrowths here are the Sporophyte, which is produced as a result of the sexual reproduction and will eventually split at the apex to release the spores. Similarly with the liverworts, these can either have a thallus mat of tissue as similar to that of the hornworts, but slightly different, or they can have a leafy green plant. And again, the Sporophyte is a relatively delicate structure which is produced and is totally dependent upon the Gametophyte. In the mosses, this is the Gametophyte green plant, and then the Sporophyte is a more persistent capsule. Now, I said initially that, I'll have a quick look at the life cycle in a minute. I said initially that the life cycle is the thing that unites these three groups, but it is the form of the Sporophyte within each group which actually distinguishes the three groups as well. So for the hornworts, this Sporophyte here grows from a basal membrane, basal meristem, sorry. So it is, as long as environmental conditions are suitable, it is capable of continued growth from the base and continuous production of spores. And then spores can be released from the apex of the capsule once they're mature. And this can continue throughout the growing season while favorable environmental conditions persist. Whereas for the liverworts, the Sporophyte here is a very transient structure. You can get an idea of how delicate these are. And I've got some other images later on to show you. And this is produced, and all the spores are produced simultaneously within this capsule, this capsule will split into valves and release the spores, and the sporophyte will disappear within a few days after this. For the mosses, the capsule is more persistent. The exact form of the capsule varies between different groups of mosses, but it can persist throughout a full year, and the spores can be dispersed gradually throughout the year. But like as in the liverworts, the spores are produced simultaneously, so the full complement of spores is produced at the same time within the moss capsule. It's just that they are dispersed over a greater period of time. Now, I don't want to spend too long on the life cycle, but I think it is fairly fundamental to get an understanding of these plants, to have an idea about their life cycle. So if we start off with the spore, when a spore is dispersed and falls in favorable environmental conditions, it will germinate. In the mosses, majority of the mosses, it will germinate to give a filamentous structure, the protonema, which looks a bit like an algal green mat. There are a couple of groups of mosses for which the protonema is thalloid rather than filamentous, and it is also thalloid in the liverworts and the hornworts. But this, I'm taking a moss example as, if you like, the standard bryophyte life cycle. This protonema is capable of producing a large number of buds, and each bud can grow into a separate individual plant. These, of course, all come from the same spore, so they are all genetically identical, and it is effectively a large colony which will eventually develop from the single spore that germinated. The buds go on to grow into individual plants, and these can form quite a tight mat of plants. Once they are sexually mature, the bryophytes can be either monoicous or dioicous, depending on the species we're dealing with. And in both cases, the sperm itself is motile. So they are totally dependent on water splash or the presence of a water film to enable fertilization to take place. Hence the emphasis given on the presence of humidity or high humidity in the environment. There are other reasons why high humidity is beneficial to bryophytes, which we'll go into later. But in the life cycle, it is the fact that you have a motile sperm. This is a sort of a colorized image. It's not true color, stained, as is the two heads, the female and the male containing the sperm. After fertilization, the zygote is the first cell of the sporophyte generation, which is diploid, and depending on which of the groups you're looking at, the mosses, the liverworts, or the hornworts, will eventually go on to produce spores. In this case, we're looking at Polletricum. This is the Polletricum capsule, and when it's mature, the spore mother cells will undergo meiotic division, which is a reduction division to produce the haploid spores and go on to produce the next generation of mosses. Few facts: sexual reproduction enables long-distance global distribution because a single capsule can have anything from hundreds of thousands to millions of spores. There are some species which produce much fewer spores per capsule, and those spores tend to be bigger. But the smallest spores, you're looking about a few micron in diameter. And these spores have been demonstrated to be able to survive conditions in high altitude air currents, which can enable global distribution. As I said before, these plants also have an amazing capacity for asexual reproduction, and the development of characters for asexual reproduction also are used for identification of species. Now, probably the easiest, the simplest approach to vegetative reproduction is fragmentation. So as the plant grows, the old stems die back and the new shoots head off as individual separate plants. One thing I always say to people, they want to get moss out of their lawn. You can rake your lawn to your heart's content. All you're going to remove is the thatch, because every single fragment of moss that you leave behind is capable of growing into a new plant. Quite often they go back to the protonemal stage. So a fragment left, if the environmental conditions are still suitable, can produce a protonema, and then the protonema will produce the buds. And hey presto, you have a whole load of new plants. Now, many, both liverworts and mosses, produce specialized gemi to facilitate vegetative reproduction, and many of them produce deciduous branchlets and flagella or deciduous leaves. Specialized bulbules grow in the axils of the leaves, which can then be washed away to enable vegetative reproduction, and rhizoidal tubers. And the final one is that the protonema itself, instead of producing buds, can also produce gemi. And we're going to have a look at some plants now. Some liverworts, which produce gemi-producing liverworts. So here you have a complex thalloid liverwort, one under the name of lunularia, named after this half-moon-shaped gemi cup. And then you can see these little green structures produced by the gemi cup, and each one of these can be washed away and can grow into producing a new plant. This is a very common garden plant. Virtually any of you who have access to a garden or to a local park are likely to be able to find lunularia there. The other three liverworts I've shown are slightly more restricted in their distribution. Odontoschisma denudatum, which produces this little apical shoot with masses of white gemi on it, on the apex, is primarily associated with peat banks, moorland, hillland. Blazier, the commonest habitat now may very well be on the side of rides in conifer plantations. That's where I usually find it. Again, these little shoots have gemi at the apex, and the Heterocolpus again has produced these brown gemi at the apex of the shoot. So if we look in the mosses, again, you've got a couple of plants here, Pseudotaxiphyllum elegans and Campylopus piriformis, which are very common in acid woodlands. You'll have banks in acid woodlands that can be covered with the Pseudotaxiphyllum, and it produces this little branchlets, which then get washed away and establish new plants when they arrive in suitable environmental conditions. The Campylopus piriformis sheds its leaves. These leaves again can get washed away, and very often when the conditions are suitable, they will go on to produce protonemal mat, which will give rise to the new plants. The bulbules, we've got Polea Drummondii here, which produces quite big bulbules. Again, this is a plant that doesn't like competition, so you quite often find it on tracks, farm tracks, quite widespread. And these big bulbules can be shed, and each one can grow into a new plant. Centrichia papilosa is a rather fine epiphyte, and I don't know if you can make it out, but along the nerve or Costa here, you have masses of gemi produced. So, and then we've got some rhizoidal tubers here. The rhizoidal tubers in the bryum can be formed in the axils of the leaves as well. In the case of Bryum rubens, this is a very common arable weed, and it's also, you're again very likely to find it in your garden, flower pots or places where you don't cultivate particularly regularly and are not overgrown by other vascular plants. Brown violaceum is the same, common arable weed these days, and has these rhizoidal tubers. And these tubers can persist in the soil when, after cultivation, and can each of them give rise to new plants when conditions are suitable. Brown riparium is a riverside species. So, as I said, we've got three different groups: the hornworts, the liverworts, and the mosses. I'm not going to overburden you with the names of all the different groups and genera. I'm just hoping to give you a brief introduction to the diversity of the morphology that we find in each of these groups. So if we consider Anthoceras first, we only have 4 species of Anthoceras in the UK, in Britain and Ireland, and all 4 of them do occur here in Scotland. Now, this is just the page of the field guide I've got here showing you the probably rather small, but you can basically see the distribution maps. And as I said before, the hornworts are a plate of tissue, and then you have sporophytes. These are young sporophytes on the Phaeoceras, and this is Phaeoceras levis, and these are more mature sporophytes on the hornwort, and you can see on the apices of the sporophyte that these are turning black, and this is because the mature spores in this species are black. So if you've got a sporophyte and it's mature and shedding its spores, if the apex is black like this, you know instantly that you have an Anthoceras in your hand. If you have the male plant, which if you've got sporophytes, the male plant's bound to be somewhere in the vicinity if you search enough, then once you take the male plant home and dissect the antheridia out, you will be able to determine which of the 2 species of Anthoceras it is. Similarly, if you've got a plant and the spores at the apex of the sporophyte are yellowish orange in color, you know you've got a Phaeoceras. And if the male are on separate plants, then you actually know you have Phaeoceras levis, because that is the dioicous species. And if it's got male and female on the one plant, you know you have Caryollinus lineanus, as that is the monoicous plant. I always like finding these plants. The majority of hornworts on a global scale are tropical. So we have a very small representative of the global diversity here. But they're still, I find them fun things to find. You know, if we go on to consider the liverworts, these are basically divided into 2 main groups, the thallus and the leafy liverworts. So the thallus liverworts have this mat of tissue, which is the Gametophyte, and the leafy liverworts, as the names imply, have leaves along a main stem. Now, the form of these leaves varies widely, and I'll give you a brief introduction to the diversity of form that you can find within the leafy liverworts. But for the moment, if we go back to the thallus liverworts, we have 2 groups within the thallus: the complex thalloid liverworts, which have an internal differentiation of their structure, and the simple thallus liverworts, which have no internal differentiation, no sort of external morphology. They're very uniform over the surface. Now, this was the lunularia that I was showing you earlier. And you can see here, you see lots of little white dots over the surface of the thallus. Now, each of these dots is a pore which opens into the subepidermal space where the chlorophyll-containing cells are. Now, these are not like stomata in vascular plants. They are continuously open pore that facilitate gaseous exchange, but have no capacity to open or close as stomata would. depending on water stress. So if we have a look here at one, Marcantia polymorpha, again, the commonest variety of this, or subspecies of this, ruderalis, is found ubiquitously throughout Scotland, very commonly associated with urban areas, perhaps areas which have got some degree of damp and are not subject to too much disturbance or too much competition from other plants. So there's a systemic diagrammatic cross-section through the thallus, and this is your little pore up here, and these pores actually have waxy plates around the mouth of the pore to stop them getting blocked by, to dispel the water and stop them getting blocked by water, to enable diffusion of air into the under epidermal space where the chlorophyll containing cells are and where photosynthesis takes place. And this is a real life photograph through the cross section of this. So you can see the pore is here and the chlorophyll containing cells. Surface view, these are your pores, and the sort of hexagonal shaped markings on the surface mark the margins of the under subepidermal space, space here. Now for these plants, it's slightly different to the leafy liverworts in that the sporophyte is born on an outgrowth of the gametophyte. So this branch here and these umbrellas are all gametophyte tissue, and then the sporophyte is this little yellow mass of spores on the underside. So again, we have a range of different complex thallus liverworts, Marcantia quadrata here, with the sporophyte developing on the underside of this gametophyte branch. And Rixia cavernosa, which is a rather spectacular plant that grows, very often you find growing on the mud of the drawdown zones of reservoirs. Now for the simple thalloid liverworts, you don't have this system of pores, and you don't have any significant internal differentiation. As you can see, some of these, the Metzgeria here, the majority of the thallus is only one cell thick, and then you have a thickened multistratose midrib up the middle. So we've got here Fossambronia, and the sporophyte of Fossambronia is almost identical to the sporophyte of the leafy liverworts, with a delicate seta and then a capsule at the apex. And Fossambronia is a common plant we often hunt for on rural paths, again somewhere where there's a bit of tramping perhaps, so there isn't too much competition from other species. And there's got a number of species that occur in this country. They're slightly problematic to identify because you have to have the sporophyte to be able to identify them, because you need to look at the ornamentation pattern of the spores to know which Fossambronia you have. Petulophyllum is a sand dune species. Again, it has a pretty amazing growth capacity to, if it gets inundated by sand, to just grow up through the sand. Riccardia palmata is a western species, not exclusively, but has a slightly more western distribution, and is very commonly found on well-rotted wood remains. So trunks or stumps of trees which have really well rotted down can have a carpet of Riccardia palmata. The Metzgeria furcata can be an epiphyte. It's commonly an epiphyte, but can also occur on rock. And I was talking earlier about vegetative reproduction, and you can see here how narrow the joining point of these little branchlets are, and all of these branchlets can be dispersed and usually washed away, moved away by water or animals or insects. And if they lodge in a suitable environmental situation, can give rise to new plants. That's a very small example of the diversity of the simple thallus liverworts. Now, the leafy liverworts, on the other hand, have an amazing diversity of leaf shape and arrangement. The haplometrium, which is perhaps the simplest of the leafy liverworts. It's just a main stem and some very slight outgrowths, basic outgrowths to form the leaf. And again, you have the typical seta, very delicate structure, and then this capsule at the apex, which is intact here, and here it's split into its valves, and the mass containing both the spores and a structure called an elater, which responds to changes in humidity and aids in spore dispersal because it flicks out the spores because it contracts and expands according to the humidity status in the environment. So it acts as like little spring coils to disrupt the spore mass and disperse the spores. Now, the leafy liverworts can consist in some cases of just simple round leaves either side of a stem. So you have a pair of leaves, and then on the underside you have a distinct row of underleaves. Now, these underleaves can be very reduced, as they are in the species we're looking at here. So in an astrophyllum, Mylia taylorii and Odontoschisma elongatum, you have a simple round leaf in pairs up the side of the main stem and a residual underleaf on the underside of the stem. And this is the leaf of Mylia taylorii, which I've always been rather fond of because this was the first leafy liverwort that I ever identified. And I looked down the microscope at this and thought, wow, isn't it beautiful? So that's the basis for my obsession with bryophytes. So Mylia is more western, montane, high hill species. An Astrophyllum alpinum, as the name implies, a montane species. Odontoschisma elongatum is commonly a lot margin species, but can be found in other wet or damp habitats. And then we go on to some leafy liverworts that have a more complex structure. So here you can see Gymnocalia inflata has quite clearly two bilobed leaves going along this main stem. And again, the underleaf is fairly obscure here, as opposed to the remaining species where the leaves and underleaves are far more complex in structure. Here you can see the Mastagophora has these very frilly leaves and underleaves. Trichocolea, the same, has very almost filamentous leaves here. And you can see this a bit clearer in the Herbertus, which is very fine, almost filamentous leaves. And the leaves and underleaves are very, very similar in these. So the Herbertus and the Mastagophora are part of our Atlantic hepatic mat species, or some of our Atlantic hepatic mat species, so they're far commoner in the West, in upland areas. Trichocolea tomentella is a woodland species commonly growing in areas of woodland flush. And Gymnocalia inflata is a moorland species often associated with path sides and pool margins. Now, I was talking earlier about how some plants some of these bryophytes are only represented by one species, one sex on an island or a continental scale. Mastigophora is one example of this. Male and female plants are not known in the UK, and obviously it never produces sporophytes, so it always gets around by vegetative reproduction and primarily by fragmentation, which is facilitated by snow cover and then being washed away by the snow. And Herbertus hutchinsonii, again, is only represented by one sex, so sporophytes are never produced. Trichocolea is, again, dioicous, and although both male and female plants are found in the UK or Britain and Ireland, there are commonly populations, whole populations, which are only one sex or the other, and obviously then never produce sporophytes. So, and then we come on to some more diverse leaf structures, diverse morphologies for the leafy liverworts, and these are leafy liverworts which have bilobed leaves where they have a larger leaf lobe and then a smaller lobule. Scapania is the same, and for these two, Perella and Fralania, they have a far more complex leaf structure. So that is your leaf lobe, and there is your leaf lobule, and these occur in pairs either side of the stem, and then along the underside of the stem you have the third row of underleaves, which are much simpler in structure. You've got a series of underleaves here. And in the Fralania, that is your leaf lobe, and then you have the lobule there, and then the row of underleaves on the underside of the stem. So a whole range in complexities of morphology for the leafy liverworts. Duinia is a upland species, commonly found growing on rocks or in rock crevices. Scapania is a high montane species. The Fralania is often considered, Fralania tamarisi is often considered a western species, but in fact I've found it growing just outside Portobello, so west of Edinburgh, so it's quite common even over in the east. And Perella, again, a woodland species. Now, if we go to look at the the mosses and diversity of morphologies associated with the mosses, I'll briefly mention Takachia, just because I think it's interesting, but the most important groups for UK and for Scotland are the Sphagnum, Sphagnopsida, Andreopsida, and the Bryophytina, which are sometimes called the true bryophytes or the true mosses. So, brief diversion to the Himalayas for Takachia. This is the Gametophyte plant, and as you can imagine, it was found in the 19th century, and everyone presumed it was a liverwort. Maybe not everyone, but the majority of people just presumed it was a liverwort. And it wasn't until over a century later the Sporophyte was found, and it was realized, in fact, that it's a very simple moss. So there are a few species of Takachia known now, but as you can see, it's got this persistent capsule which opens by a single split, and the spores inside fall out and disperse. There's no elater, so it's quite definitely a moss capsule rather than a liverwort capsule. Now we come to my favorite group of mosses, and could arguably be considered the single most important genus globally, which is the sphagnums. Now, we only have a limited Sphagnum flora in this country. We have 38 species, one of which hasn't been seen historically for some time. So effectively 37 species, all of which grow in Scotland. And as you can see, they come in a wide range of colours and grow in some
Liz, are you okay? You're muted, Liz. We're just having a few technical difficulties. I think Liz's bandwidth is struggling. Liz, you're still muted.
unmute myself and then try and yes, I did warn Natalie when she asked me that even though I've had my internet upgraded and in theory sorted recently, I still do have some problems. So
no problem at all, Liz. If you can, your presentation is stopped. That's the only thing. If you want to restart that, and you could possibly turn your camera off, that might help us because we can hear you fine, and that might just let the bandwidth cope with your presentation and your audio.
Okay.
If that works, we'll just let Liz get herself sorted again, people. Such are the trials of technology. Don't worry, Liz.
So I stopped video and
start it again. You might just have to whiz through some of your, I don't know if it should reload from where you started, possibly.
Okay, is that reloading?
Let's give it a minute, a second.
Because I've got it up on my screen, but I don't know if it's coming up.
No, it's not. Do you want to stop sharing and then start sharing again, Liz, maybe?
Okay. Oh, perhaps I need to click start share again.
That might be it.
Right. Is that showing? Is that showing now?
Not yet, Liz. Let's just see. It might just.
Let's have a. I've switched my video off, and my internet is showing as being connected now.
Shouldn't be linked to your video being on. I am going to claim back host if I can.
Yep.
And then give it back to you again and see if that helps.
Okay, I'll come out of the presentation and
let's give this back to you. And we'll just start again. Let's try and see if it works this time, Liz. Fingers crossed.
So I click share screen.
Exactly, and just go and choose your presentation. There we go. It's coming back now.
Okay. Right. Are we
Excellent.
back?
Sorted, Liz. Yeah, that's perfect. We can see you now and we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, apologies for wonky internet, the bane of the modern world. Right, so where was I? Sphagnums. Okay. They're just lovely plants. They grow in wonderful places. And they're my favorite group of mosses. And they're characterized by the heads of the stem, which are these what we call a capitulum, which are very short branches packed tightly together at the apex. And then you have a branch coming down, main stem, sorry, coming down. And off that you have little bunches of branchlets. called fascicles. We needn't worry about the precise terminology now. Right. Why do I think they're so special? Well, they've got some very distinct morphology. They've also got some fun facts associated with them. So, unlike the liverworts that we were looking at earlier, this growth supporting the sporophyte is not a sporophyte, it is an outgrowth of the gametophyte, and the sporophyte is this capsule on the top. And as you can see, this is a round capsule and it's got a little lid on the top. When the spores are mature, this capsule dries and builds up tension until it eventually pops the lid off. Now we've got some very sophisticated technology. About a decade ago, I did some measurements on this and discovered that when the lid pops off the capsule, it produces a vortex of spores, and the acceleration of these spores has been measured at 36,000 G, and the velocity, the terminal speed, at the equivalent at 144 kilometers per hour. That's not bad going for a moss plant, is it? The other reason they're so important at an environmental scale, and the why they're so important on a global scale, is to do with their leaf morphology. And this is the photograph under a microscope, and you can see this is the green cell containing the chloroplasts. And then in between the green cells, you have these big, wide, empty cells. That is just one cell there. And these bands across are reinforcing bands that spiral around the outside of the cell, which give this effectively empty space some structure. If you look at it in cross-section, you can see that the green chlorophyll cells occupy a relatively limited proportion of the plant, and the big space is this empty, which is effectively a water reservoir, a water-containing space. So on an environmental scale, these plants are responsible for holding a huge volume of water. If you think every single leaf on every single stem on every single plant has this water holding capacity. I'll come back to this later on, hopefully, as I get through to the end of my talk. The next group of mosses is the granite mosses. Anyone who's been up the hills will have seen these closely pressed black mats growing on rocks. This is a SEM of the Sporophyte, and again, the stalk that supports the Sporophyte is actually an outgrowth of the Gametophyte, and the Sporophyte is only this little structure at the top. And you can see these up on the hills, and they just rupture into 4 segments, and the spores are shaken out between them. There's a number of species of andreas, and they all tend to be hillland or high altitude species. Another plant that, if you're used to going out in the woods or up the hills, you will be familiar with is Polletricum. Just look at the volume of biomass that represents in the ecosystem. These plants have a specialized leaf structure and specialized structures associated with the sporophyte. So we go on to look at that. Now, the majority of moss leaves are 1 cell thick, and a lot of them do have a multi-stratose central strand we call the Costa, which I suppose you could say is equivalent to a midrib. In Polletricum, that Costa is very wide, and it has these lamellae which run the length of the Costa. So these are the photosynthetic containing cells, and this increases the photosynthetic area of the plant, and also, of course, it can trap humidity between these leaves, between these lamellae running along the leaf. So it's a leaf structure which is unique to the Polletricales. And at the sporophyte, at the mouth of the capsule, you have these structure called the peristome teeth. And in this particular group, the peristome teeth is united by a membrane at their tips. So it forms like a little pepper pot. and the spores are dispersed between in the gaps between the openings of the teeth. Another Polletricum, Polletricum juniperoinum, and another one in the Polletricales, but slightly different form. In the Atricum, the leaf lamellae is fairly broad and the costa is narrow, and these are the leaf lamina is fairly broad and the costa is narrow, and the lamellae run the length of the costa. You're quite likely, if any of you have got a garden, if you go out and hunt around in a damp corner of your garden, you're quite likely to find you've got Atricum undulatum growing there. Two different groups include Tetraphis, which produces these gemmy cups on the apex of the outgrowing apex of the shoot. So you've got a little cup there formed by the specialized leaves, and the gemmy are produced inside there. And this is a typical species of rotten wood. Oedipodium, which is a low hill species, not particularly common, again forms these specialized gemmy cups at the apex of the shoot, and then the gemmy sitting here inside the cups. So now, if you try to key mosses out, if you ever get to that stage, there's one term that you're going to come across. At some point in your dichotomous key, it will ask you whether your moss is Acrocarpus or Pleurocopus. So we need to have a quick look at what this means. Basically, an Acrocarpus moss has a single growth along a single axis, and when it produces a sporophyte, the sporophyte terminates the growth along that axis, and continued growth is by means of a lateral bud immediately below. The result of this, implication for this for growth form, is that Acrocarpus mosses tend to have a very upright growth, not particularly branched, often quite clump forming, and sporophytes produced at the tip of the main shoot. The Pleurocarps, in contrast, are mat forming, can be very branched, pinnate, bipinnate, tripinnate. And for the Pleurocarps, the sporophytes are produced on these little side branches. So each sporophyte terminates the growth of that side branch, but the main stem apical growth continues unabated. So it results in two totally different growth forms associated with whether it is a Pleurocarpus or an Acrocarpus species. So an example of each here, Tortula muralis, again, a very common urban moss, is an Acrocarpus moss. And one thing you can see here, you can see the white hair tips on the leaf. Well, I'll come back to talk about that later when we're looking at ecology and adaptations to drought-stressed environments. And a common, very common Pleurocopus moss, Hypnum cupressiforme. And again, you've got the capsules here. And at the mouth of the capsule, you have the peristomes. And I'll just show you the peristomes for these two species. This is these are both SEMs. This is a colored SEM. But you can see how ornate these teeth are that occur at the mouth of the capsule. And these serve to facilitate spore dispersal. So this is a very classic Tortula peristome, which you can easily see with a hand lens in the field. And this is the peristome of Hypnum cupressiforme, which has two rings of teeth, an inner ring of teeth that is static, and an outer ring of teeth that respond to changes in humidity and either open or close depending on the environment. So there are some species which close when damp, and there are some species which open when damp. This here is actually an artifact caused by the teeth actually slightly fracturing when I was putting it in the SEM. So, but they have an amazing diversity of morphologies associated with just the peristome teeth of Pleurocopus mosses. So if we look at some species, common and not so common, Dicranum major is a common woodland species, a lovely big, bold dicranum with curved branches to the apex of the shoot. Racematrium lanuginosum, heathland, moorland, bogland species. Anyone who's been up the Cairngorms will have walked for miles on Racematrium heath. A very, very fine moss. It can occur anywhere from down at almost sea level up to our mountain tops, very widespread. Bryum weigelii, much more restricted distribution, is associated with particular flushes in hill and montane areas. Oops. And tetraplodons, 2 species of tetraplodon. These belong to a family of plants called the Sphagnum, and they have a particular growth habitat. They're associated with either droppings or dead animal bones. And very often, many of these species have much bigger spores than the ones I were talking about, much fewer spores produced, and insects and flies are believed to aid dispersal of these spores to other droppings or animal carcasses. These particular ones usually occur on foxscat. Now, some Pleurocopus mosses. Again, this is just a brief introduction to give you a taste for the diversity that's associated with the bryophytes. If anyone's got a garden and they've got a lawn, chances are, unless you're a very particular gardener, you will have Retidiadelphus squarosus growing somewhere in it. It is the bane of gardeners who like grass in their lawn. I love mosses in my lawn. I think they make much better lawn than any grass does, but never mind. So that's Retidiadelphus squarosus. That's the plant that people try to rake out of their lawns. And of course, every fragment that they leave behind grows into a new plant eventually. Brachythecium rotabulum, a common woodland species, can be an epiphyte at the base of stems, grows on the ground, grows on logs. And if you've got a damp or a rich garden, you're quite likely to be able to find it in your back garden. The other two are growing far more interesting, specific habitats. Entodon is a species of calcareous grassland, which, as you all realize, is a fairly limited habitat in Scotland. So when you find it, it's always a nice thing to find. And it also actually grows on the Outer Hebridean macaire, because that's shell sand, so it is itself calcareous. And the full length of the macaire, if you hunt hard enough, you can find Entodon growing. A Myurium, I think, is a very splendid plant, very attractive, and again grows in beautiful areas. It's maybe not purely coastal, but it is usually found within sight of the sea. It has a restricted distribution on the west coast. It's known from, I think, only one site in Ireland, and then it grows in the Canaries and the Azores, and that is it. So again, it's always a plant that you're very excited, very pleased when you do find it, especially if it's a new site where it hasn't previously been known before. So I want to give you a sort of a smorgasbord of facts about the physiology of bryophytes. They have an amazing capacity, at least some of them, some of the moss species particularly, have the amazing capacity to dry out rather, to 5 to 10% of their wet weight. And when water's available again, they can recover almost completely. They take up water and nutrients carbon dioxide directly into the cells. So they're not dependent on a conducting system, they're not dependent on roots. So they can assimilate water as soon as it becomes available. And if you're going out identifying mosses, dry weather, dry summer day, everyone carries with them a little spray bottle. You can't quite see what you're looking at, you give it 2 squirts of water, and within a few seconds, it's fully hydrated again, and you can identify it much more easily. Because they can take up water, carbon dioxide directly into the cells, photosynthetic induction can start in approximately 90 seconds as compared to in the region of 5 minutes that it takes for vascular plants. Photosynthesis is a C3 pathway, and a consequence of this is that these plants are capable of photosynthesis in both low light levels and low temperatures. The low light levels facilitate growth in places like understory of woodlands. Low temperatures mean that they can continue to grow beneath an ice cover. Now, a couple of other, I think, very interesting facts. There is one desert species at least, which after 20 years in a dried herbarium packet, the actual green plant itself, when minced up and hydrated and put onto an agar plate, started to grow again. There is work looking at mosses which have been under a glacier for 400 years. They've been collected, put in the lab, they continue to grow. A friend of mine, Esme Rhodes, worked in Antarctica, and there are what they call moss banks down there, which are frozen, except at the very surface level. It's effectively permafrost. They took cores down through the permafrost, dated the material at the base, carbon dating, to 1,500 years old, put it onto agar plates, and it grew. I think mosses are amazing plants. So, because of these capacities, they are, and in some cases, they grow better in the absence of too much competition. They tend to be plants of extreme habitats, wetlands, mires, peatlands, bogs, very dry habitats as well, because they can, as we said with the plant growing surviving and growing after 20 years in a herbarium packet. Plants of desert areas and fragments can persist in the ecosystem, and when suitable conditions occur, i.e. it rains, then they can grow and a whole new generation can be perpetuated. Mountains, it's the moss and the lichens, which are going to be very often the last plants that you will come across, and similarly tundra. As I said, permafrost, and you can still have, under ice, you can still have growing and living plants. They're very often the first plants that come along and start stabilizing and colonizing unstable environments. If you leave a bit of your corner of your garden uncultivated over the winter and without any crop on it or any plants on it, you come along in the spring, you'll find there's a whole host of bryophytes have managed to establish themselves in that short time. And there are some unstable habitats and environments which will only be colonized by bryophytes. There are some species that have the capacity to withstand metal toxicity. And again, in forest and woodland habitats, they can be dominant on the forest floor and can have a huge biomass. Now, they're sensitive to environmental conditions, especially some of the liverworts. So acid rain, air pollution reduces the diversity that are present. It's only the very resistant ones that retain. And when environmental conditions improve, the mosses come back in. And the only environment where we don't find them is maritime. However, they do occur within the splash zone of the sea, and a couple of species that we have in Britain are Cystidium moretum and Tortula flavivarens. Both of them can occur within the splash zone. Now, as I said before, they can take in water throughout the plant, whole plant, and they can dry and rehydrate once water, survive drying and rehydrating once water is available. From the point of view of identifying them, one consequence of this is that you need to learn two different jizzes, basically, because some of them can look totally different when they're wet and they're dry. This is a nomodon, and as you can see, you've got totally different morphology. This is the dry and this is the wet. I also learned to my cost that if you go out in winter, sometimes you have to learn a third jizz, and that's frozen. They do look very different somehow when they've got a covering of ice all over them. And your hands get very cold trying to thaw them out. Now you have a range of morphological adaptations for different habitats. So Fontanelis antipyretica is a common plant of fast-flowing or reasonably fast-flowing mountain and lowland streams. And these have a hold fast and then produce these long, flexible branches which can withstand being tossed about by the current. The sphagnums, well, all of them can be considered hygrophytes, basically, or the majority of them can, but especially Sphagnum platyphyllum, found at the edges of slightly flushed zones, maybe in hill ground or even low ground, where you've got maybe a little bit of flushing, but they like to be in an area where they do have some continual moisture available to them. Epiphytes, again, huge range of species growing on trees. There's a substrate here. We have this, the green here is the moss, Zygodon conoideus with its sporophytes, and the brown here is the Fralania dilatata, a common epiphyte. As with the other Fralanias I showed you earlier, it has a main leaf lobe, and then it has this lobule which forms a little helmet, and then has the underleaf, which is a row of third, much smaller underleaves going up the underside of the stem. And these helmets are quite clearly sort of identified here by the air bubble that's trapped inside them. And they probably served a function to hold water, retain water, because as you would imagine, a tree trunk, tree branch can be quite a drought-stressed environment, depending on the situation in which the tree is growing. So we've got plants of disturbed and unstable habitats, and these form a diaspore bank with various structures, including the gemi on the roots. And they tend to be characterized by having a very short life cycle and persistent diaspores or gemi or fragments which are left in the soil. A lot of these are arable weeds now. If we're considering not such extreme dry habitats, but urban rock walls, you'll find this plant. And I said before, when I was talking about Tortula muralis, about the white hairpoint, this is another plant with white hairpoints. Often these plants which grow in potentially drought-stressed environments have a white tip to their leaf, and these tips act as a focal point for dew condensation overnight, and they form these tight clumps. And you can see from this one, the sporophytes in their early life, part of the life cycle, are protected because they're hidden down in amongst the leaves. And only when they start to mature does the seta elongate and straighten to elevate the sporophytes against the capsule. This is a very common urban plant. Go out and look at any brick wall in your or any stone wall, concrete finished wall, and you're almost certain to find Grimmia pulvinata. Again, adaptations to cold conditions tend to be very low growing, so they don't get knocked or damaged with snow cover and clump forming. So I was talking about how Scotland has a high diversity of the global total, and I've talked a bit about their physiology and ability to survive in extreme environments. They are also an essential component of healthy ecosystems, and they provide a number of ecosystem services. And then I'll go on briefly to mention carbon dioxide storage. So their ecosystem services, I don't know whether there are any figures for northern temperate ecosystems. There's been a lot of work done in the tropics, typically in the high altitude mist forests, where the mosses, the bryophytes and mosses in particular, are responsible for the storage of a huge quantity of water and maintaining the humidity, reducing water loss from the soil. They trap sediments, they stabilize bare ground. Pioneer species initiate vegetation succession, and because of these, they provide a habitat for a range of other organisms. I'll give you a reference at the end to a book called Bryophyte Ecology, which is an online freely accessible book by Janice Gleim. Absolutely brilliant resource. She's got a whole section on all the other organisms which are associated with and dependent upon and make their life in mosses. And anyone who's got nest boxes in their garden, if you've ever come to clear your nest box out in the autumn, you'll find, especially with the blue tit, the tits, well, all the tit species, that the moss is a major component of the nests and serves some very interesting functions. Historically, humanity has used mosses. It dries out and it has a springy quality to it when it's dried out. So it's very useful as a packing material, protecting goods. In fact, in some parts of the world, it's still used for this today. It's very absorbent, at least the sphagnum are very absorbent, and I'll mention that again, we'll come on to that later. So it's been used historically for nappies and other necessities which need to be absorbent. It's used for animal bedding. It has some antimicrobial properties. So it historically was a popular bedding source. It's used for building. The Polletricums can be woven to form mats and ropes, and modern uses include horticulture and the greening of buildings and moss gardening. And then I'll briefly look at its role in carbon storage. From, this looks like Victorian times, collecting the peats. I don't know to what extent people still dig peats today, but certainly when I was a child, going on holiday, you could always see the peat stacks. This is just up the road in Falkirk, was a site that was where peat was extracted for horticulture. Bournemouth in Ireland have only very recently stopped peat extraction for fire stations. A lot of uses for horticulture. This is actually taken on the continent. You can see a sort of hoovering up of the dried peat, and collection of sphagnum moss still goes on today. In fact, we import it from New Zealand. I have reservations about the environmental impact of importing sphagnum from New Zealand, but we do. Other modern uses now used in architecture. I'm not quite sure how long this internal moss wall is going to survive. I hope they've got an adequate misting system to keep it there. Depending on the nature of the climate, the external ones or the moss walls should maybe do a slightly better. And of course, moss gardening, cultural importance in Japan. And there are a range of beautiful sites in Japan, but you don't have to go as far as Japan. Just up the road in Dollar, there is our very own Scottish Japanese garden. The garden as a whole has about 115 species of bryophytes recorded in it. And these little island beds alone have 39 different species of bryophyte associated with them when we went up there recording. So that's the island beds in the formal raked gravel part of the moss garden and Cowden. Now, I said before, I've mentioned briefly how important sphagnum is and how this is associated with our leaf morphology. During the First World War, sphagnum moss was used as a wound dressing. It was collection was organized initially by the Regis Keeper at the RBGE, Professor Balfour, and by the end of the war, the collecting system organized throughout Scotland supplied 1 million dressings a month to the front. Its value as a wound dressing is its capacity to absorb wound exudate, its ability to lower pH in its immediate environment, which inhibits the growth of bacteria, pathogenic bacteria associated with human wounds, infection in human wounds, and the pores in the cells, the hyaline cells, the size of the pores is sufficiently large that both bacteria and blood can be assimilated into the plant and then removed. And you've seen this slide before. These big spaces here are the reason why sphagnum was so useful as a wound dressing. There have been talks of it actually having an antibiotic component. We have looked at this and no one has been able to extract a single antibiotic component from the sphagnum moss yet. It seems most likely that it functions as in an antibiotic capacity when it is used as a whole plant. And because of this, these plants, not necessarily Sphagnum palustre per se, but a range of different sphagnum species, are actually the major component of peat. And that is why it is such an important genus on a global scale. This looks at the increase in carbon storage and the increase in peatland since the end of the last ice age up to the modern day. And the vast majority of this peat storage will be sphagnum. Carbon storage in peat will be because of the sphagnum assimilated into peat and the very low decomposition rate associated with it. So Scotland, we have a significant land area that's peat covered. The other rather depressing statistic that I got from Nature Scot is that 80% of our Scottish peatlands are considered degraded. And if we're going to play our role as a nation in carbon sequestration and ameliorating climate change, that figure needs to be dramatically reduced in the coming years. A couple of other statistics I've got here. The value of peatlands and consequently the value of sphagnum. You wouldn't have these peatlands storing this carbon if you didn't have sphagnum. It's a very important plant. Now, if you want to learn how to identify bryophytes, a couple of sources. You've got the BBS field guide, which is also available online, but you have to access it a page at a time, obviously. If you've got access to a microscope, the moss flora is Smith, the liverwort flora is Jean Payton. Field Study Councils produce a number of basic guides which give you a quick photographic introduction. Plant Life has a basic introductory guide to Scottish mosses, and then a few how to look after your mosses. So information for managers, land managers on various plants. Moss gardening, you've got Annie Martin's book, and you can, the BBS website will give you access to Michael Fletcher's PDF on Moss Growers Handbook. If you're really interested in learning more about recording, join a local BBS recording group. We've got 4 of them in Scotland now. There's 23 scattered throughout the UK. As you can see, a lot of the local vice counties are now covered with recording, and nothing beats getting out in the field with your fellow bryologists and learning from each other. That's the only way I learn, and I think it's the way everyone learns. You can battle away on your own as well, but it does help to be able to show things to other people and say, am I right here? Have I got this plant identified correctly? So online resources, as I said, the British Bryological Society website has the field guide under species finder. Cornish Bryophytes, you might think that's a long way away, but David Holyoake's got some lovely photos. Germany's even further. But Michael Luth has some lovely images. And as I say, Janice Gleim's Bryophyte Ecology book, freely available online, an amazing resource for anything you want to learn about bryophyte and bryophyte ecology. Those are the references that I've cited in my presentation. And lastly, I'd like to finish off by thanking the support I have received over the last 2 decades from the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh, in allowing me to retain my association with them as a research associate, and all the staff there, but especially my fellow bryologists, the 3 Davids and Neil, and the support of all my colleagues and friends in the British Bryological Society who taught me how to identify bryophytes in the first place.